So this far along the research, how much does power matter and how much does culture matter?
Take power first. I think one of the themes, one of the questions is exactly that. There's one story about emerging powers, which is just a power story. It's just, you have a ranking and you measure your GMP, you measure military power, and that's what it is. It's just the rise and fall of people according to their material power. But even about people who saw the world in terms of power. So for these people, what counts? If you're an emerging power, what does it mean? It means you're going to be part of the world of the balance of power. You're going to be a great power. And that mostly is seen in terms of material power, but not always. And again, one of the interesting things is that even on that side of the debate, historically, if we look back in time, it was never just a matter of power. Japan did all of the classic things that a great power should do. It beat another great power, beat Russia in 1904, 1905. And yet the existing countries were very hesitant about treating Japan as a great power. So even in the great power club, the question of whether power is enough is the question. And then when we move into, if you like, a changing world, we have another set of questions about, well, what is the power that counts? Is it just material, hard power? Or to be successful as an emerging country, to gain membership, not of the Great Power Club, but of different clubs, do you have to have other things? Do you have to have soft power? Do you have to have normative power? Do you have to have different sorts of capacities? And I think that's, again, one of the interesting things. Now, in answer to your question, I think in some ways the answer is yes, material power does matter. India has a set of capabilities which tempts it to play in a more traditional great power game. And it's been, in a sense, presented with the possibility, because of its own economic development, because of becoming a nuclear power, because of its geopolitical position with China, with the United States. It was presented in a way which is completely different to Brazil, with the option of renegotiating its relationship with the United States. So power gave it a different set of options, which didn't remove the interest in institutions and the WTO and things, but it gave it an additional option that came from power. And there is a temptation in a rising India to say, this is really the game that we should play. We shouldn't be an old third world power. We shouldn't be a power that's worried about coalitions and institutions. We should be a big power playing in that game. Even in India, it's only one part of the story. And those people who said, no, the US, this is going to be the center of everything, and there are a lot of people like that, it actually hasn't worked out like that. That's one part of its policy, but it still kept these other ones. So yes, power does make a difference. India has options in terms of relations with particularly the other major powers in the system, which Brazil doesn't have. And if you think of Brazil as being, in material terms, sort of that much lower, if you like, in a kind of hierarchy, you can see how that then plays out in terms of maintaining the Brazilian priority on multilateralism, on institutions, on coalitions. So power, I mean, we can maybe talk more in different areas, but power clearly matters. I still think it's always interesting, though, how power is perceived and constructed, rather than just kind of what power is in a kind of hard sense. So, take nuclear weapons, or take, becoming a nuclear power. In the old power game, this was really important. This is how you became a military power. You got new weapons. Well, India did that, and that was tremendously important, forcing recognition, particularly from the United States, and then negotiating the acceptance of India as a nuclear power in 1998. But it couldn't just do that. It also had to play by some of the new rules. It had to convince institutions, other partners, that it accepted the dominant norms of so it stood outside the old Non-Proliferation Treaty. It said, we don't want to go there, it's discriminating. It forced on the back of its own power acceptance of itself as a nuclear power. But at the same time, in a new world, it realized that it would also have to say, we're a responsible power. We accept the norms of non-proliferation. We want to be a member of a responsible group of major powers. So even somewhere like that, which is the hardest case, I mean, that's real material hard power, even there, you still have to understand it together with norms and institutions rather than separately. Culture, I think, is harder. It's quite hard to find examples of kind of culture with a capital C and see how that translates. Maybe it doesn't translate, it only translates over big periods of time, so maybe it's quite hard to get hold of. Or maybe it translates more indirectly. So not necessarily because India is a non-Western country and it connects with a set of particular non-Western values. Maybe there's some of that. We haven't found a great deal. Where it does connect, though, is the historical sense of we are a major non-Western country that has been developing against the background of a Western-dominated international system. We were a colonial country. We were a great civilization that was colonized. And that means that we have a certain view of where we think we should be in the world, and also where, if you like, the obstacles are. We care a great deal about status. I mean, almost everybody who writes about India makes this point, that we care about our status and standing. We don't just care about immediate interests on this issue or that issue. Maybe some of that comes from the perception of having been a great historic civilization. Certainly, a good deal of it comes from having been a colonized country that suffered a subordinate position in a Western-dominated system. So that idea that the world is changing, you guys can't just carry on telling us what we should do. We're an equal player in the system. I think that part one could maybe see culture, civilization, but I'm not sure about the non-West, because of course, we can see some of that too in Brazil, and we can have arguments forever about whether Brazil is Western, non-Western, a part of the West, and so on and so forth. But clearly that sense, particularly under this government, but with a tradition that goes further back, of saying that we think we do have a legitimate right to be a major player in the system. There's the quotation that President Lula gave, I think, quite early on to a group of diplomats in Itamaraty, where he says, we're not the little ones of Latin America. We don't just play soccer and have carnival and have street children. Of course we do those things, but we're also a major country, and we want to be respected as a major country. And that theme about not being a little country, wanting respect, wanting to be part of this international decision-making, that's become, to have a status. That's become a major theme, particularly of this government, and particularly of parts of this government. There was the interview over the weekend with Samuel Pinheiro Guimarães, where he talked about, we don't have to ask permission to talk to the president of Iran. And that idea that we've come from a place in history where there was a sense that we were subordinate, and both part of emergence is not, again, just the material side. It's about countries saying, demanding, asking, pushing for a different kind of position in the way in which, power works, and particularly the way in which institutions work, decision-making works. I think that's a very important part of what we mean by emergence. We don't just mean we've got an economy that grows. We don't just mean that we've got these weapons or those weapons. We also mean that that is translated into a different focus on how decisions are made, where decisions are made, who makes them. I think that the politics of, that is a central part of the politics of emerging countries and an international emergence.